It is no accident that on the day Hitler invaded Poland, orders went out for the extermination of the incurably ill and the chronically insane in German hospitals. Some 70,000 died before ecclesiastical intervention put a stop to the practice. But by that time, much had been learnt that could be put to use in the genocide to follow. When the young Hitler did this self-portrait, he lived in Vienna. That's where he came to admire the politics of Karl Lueger, Imperial Vienna's greatest mayor. Lueger gave his city a fine transport system, better schooling, better police, a lot of new jobs. Lueger was also an anti-Semite. But what to him was a political ploy was to Hitler an obsession. As Hitler saw it, in the endless struggle for life, the weak went to the wall while the strong survived and prospered. A nation's strength, he believed, lay in its racial purity, and Germany's purity, her national health and vigor, even her survival, were menaced by racial corruptions represented by the Jews. A corruption not merely physical, but spiritual and moral as well. For Hitler, the evidence of how dangerous this was lay all around. The humiliating peace of the First World War, the slough of decadence and despond that followed were all the work of Jews. So was Russian communism, so was the Great Depression. The conclusion is clear. Rid the world of Jews. Rid the world of Slavs, of colored races, of mixed breeds and gypsies and homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses and communists and, of course, the mentally ill. You name them, we kill them. Rid the world of all these people, and it would be a better place. In Mein Kampf, we find some of this farrago of paranoia and ill-digested social Darwinism. This was Hitler's long-term program. Many Germans and non-Germans, even among his supporters, took it lightly or treated it with indifference. But Hitler was consumed by it, and the Germans, most of whom accepted Hitler's decisions wholeheartedly, were going to be consumed as well. The war provided Hitler an opportunity to move full steam ahead, regardless of any effects it might have on the German war effort. Millions of Jews from France to Russia were rounded up and sent off to concentration camps, slave societies whose inmates could be worked to death in factories run by German business, or else simply starved, tortured, and executed. Mass gassing procedures were introduced at the camps in 1942. They were far more efficient than earlier methods. This is how one eyewitness describes the procedure. The first train arrived, 45 freight cars with 6,700 people, of which 1,450 were already dead on arrival. A large loudspeaker blares instructions: undress completely, take off artificial limbs, glasses, and so on. Hand in all valuables. Women and girls to the barber, who cuts off their hair in 2 or 3 strokes and stuffs it into potato sacks. Then the line starts moving. At the corner, an SS man announces in a pastoral voice, "Nothing will happen to you. Just breathe deeply inside the chambers. It stretches the lungs. This inhalation is necessary against the illnesses and epidemics." But the majority knows what is ahead. The stench tells their fate. By 1945, about 6 million of the 8.5 million Jews under German occupation had been killed, 2 million of them here in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. When the camps were liberated at the end of the war, the international community was finally forced to acknowledge their existence, which had been known for some time. But however eloquent the world's rejection of Nazi barbarism, this sort of atrocity perpetuated by a hitherto civilized state set an example. It suggested possibilities that colored the subsequent history of the 20th century. Hitler's racial theory, like the communist theory of class war, implied social engineering on a grand scale. As Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, explained to his staff, what happens to a Russian, to a Czech, does not interest me in the slightest. What the nations can offer in the way of good blood of our type, we will take, if necessary, by kidnapping their children and raising them here with us. Whether nations live in prosperity or starve to death like cattle interests me only insofar as we need them as slaves to our Kultur. Masses of human beings were to be moved about, used, altered, indoctrinated, exterminated according to abstract principles. War itself, the mass movement of armies, prisoners, refugees, contributed to this and intensified it. A quarter of a century earlier, during the First World War, the Germans had occupied most of Belgium and a large slice of France. 1.5 million people were then turned into refugees and many others into slave labor for Germany's war effort. The army commander, General Ludendorff, herded 400,000 Belgians into German factories. All this would be repeated on a much vaster scale by the Nazis. In August 1944, 7.5 million foreigners worked in German industry alone, including nearly 2 million prisoners of war, over 5 million forced laborers from a dozen countries. The Germans were not alone in this, however. The Russians, who knew all about social engineering, had been moving or killing millions of their own people for a generation. In 1929, for instance, Joseph Stalin delivered a speech justifying his policy of collectivization and the need to eliminate the kulaks, Russia's relatively well-off independent peasants. The kulaks were resisting the loss of their farms for rather obvious reasons. And this is what Stalin has to say about it, and the leaden language is all his. Can we advance our socialized industry at an accelerated rate while having to rely on an agricultural base such as is provided by small peasant farming, which is incapable of expanded production? No, we cannot. What then is the solution? The socialist way is to set up collective farms and state farms, the way which leads to the squeezing out of the capitalist elements from agriculture. That is why we have recently passed from the policy of restricting the exploiting proclivities of the kulaks to the policy of eliminating the kulaks as a class. And eliminate them he did. Millions of them. Of course, it's much easier to do this sort of thing when you don't see people as individuals, but as a class or a race or a problem to be solved.